So it's kind of eerie that this adaptation of The Stand on CBS All Access is coming out this year. And if you don't know why it's eerie, then you probably have not read the book upon which it's based, Stephen King's The Stand. And this is a book that people have mixed opinions on. I think that the majority of people consider it to be Stephen King's masterpiece, and they would, put it on their shelf, as their equivalent of War and Peace. That's how highly they esteem this book. But for me, and I'm Drew, by the way, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. If I had to say one thing about this book, I think that while Stephen King is a very good writer, it does show a lot of his deficiencies as a storyteller. But one thing, I read this book by him called On Writing, where he talked about his writing method, where what he'll do is he'll find a really, really interesting situation. For instance, he'll have a character in a car and there'll be a dog on the outside of the car, and the character has to figure out how they're going to get out of this situation. Or, as in the case with The Stand, you have a really, really interesting situation. And this is what makes it eerie that this is coming out in 2020, where there's this global pandemic that wipes out 7 billion people and leaves the survivors trying to figure out how to reestablish civilization in the wreckage. And he's really good at starting a story because he doesn't outline and he doesn't try to figure out where the story is going. He just kind of goes with it. And I think that in this story in particular, I think that gets him into trouble. It's quite long, and I think if he is a very good writer, but I think if there's one thing that this story does is that it just seeps into your brain because there's so much of it, and that over time it just wears you down with its scope and its sheer size. And it's interesting, the sheer volume of this story would make it very, very hard to adapt. And Josh Boone, director of Fault in Our Stars, has taken it on. I should mention that there are supernatural aspects to this story that kind of separate it from something like The Walking Dead. In The Walking Dead, of course, they're very much interested in restarting civilization and what civilization means as well. But in The Walking Dead, I think that there is more of a dog-eat-dog mentality, whereas here, Stephen King establishes kind of a good versus evil conflict, with the good being led by Mother Abigail, here played by Whoopi Goldberg, and the evil led by Randall Flagg, here played by Alexander Skarsgard. And we don't get to see a ton of those two characters in this episode, just a little bit, enough to whet our appetites. But I have to say that overall, I think that I enjoyed this episode. I was entertained. I thought the pacing was quite good. I thought the casting choices were good. But I have to say that I do think that there were some structural choices that overall weakened the story. And similar to it, and I'll get into this into more detail in a second, they made some decisions in order to just manage the scope of the story that I would argue kind of weakened the story overall in their attempt to manage it. But overall, I was pretty entertained. I think that I have some things I would quibble about, but it's not a massive disappointment. Now, again, I'm not the biggest fan of this novel. I think that, in my response to this series, I'm obviously not going to have the same response to someone who's a diehard fan of the Stephen King novel. There might be things that they think, well, this was an absolute necessity to get this right, and they didn't get it right, and therefore I hate this adaptation. Whereas for me, I'm not going to come at it that way. But I do have to say that there are very, very immediate and obvious ways in which the novel is superior to the series, in which the adaptational changes they've made in order to try and make it more manageable have weakened the story. And an example of this, I would argue, in It Chapter 1 and It Chapter 2, and with the 1980s miniseries adaptation of It, they did something similar where they tried to change the focus of the story so that it would only focus on the characters as children in one half and then as adults in the other half, instead of telling the story all at once and intertwined the way that Stephen King did in the novel. And here something similar happens where they're trying to make it more manageable by, instead of having kind of darting back and forth between the various characters as this pandemic kills 7 billion people and kind of disrupts civilization as we know it, the series chooses to focus on a couple characters at a time. In this premiere episode, we get to see Stu Redman played capably, but not overwhelmingly, by James Marsden, and Owen Teague plays Harold, who is one of the more interesting characters from the novel. I think he does quite a good job conveying the fact that this is someone who's sympathetic, who's been downtrodden by life, but there's this subtle darkness to him that kind of keeps us at arm's length a little bit. And we also get to see some other characters in the premiere. We get to see Hamish Linklater and J.K. Simmons in smaller roles, and we get introduced to Franny, played by Odessa Young, who's this young woman who has to bury her family. And, all the relatable aspects and the intensity of Stephen King's work are here, but I would argue that because instead of showing the full scope of it by cutting between the characters and just showing the chaos of it, I think things end up being feeling kind of subdued, and it kind of loses some of the scope that was the novel's greatest strength. I also have to say that I think the decision to start this series makes the interesting structural decision to start with the characters already in the civilization that forms in the aftermath, and then to go back in flashbacks, and sometimes even in flashbacks within flashbacks, which normally I would really, really be heavily critical of, but here I didn't think that they were too off-putting. But I feel that this decision kind of undercuts the storytelling because it makes things seem less life and death when we know who survives. And quite frankly, I think it just makes the story have less momentum. It makes it feel more slow moving and less, like I said, less momentum. I also feel like there's this very obvious scene at the end of this episode in which they show a soldier fleeing this installation where the virus apparently started. And to me, that was very obviously what should have been the first scene of this episode, because it doesn't really do anything at the end of this episode. I mean, I think it's intended to be a end credit sting where it happens right before the credits, so it leaves you thinking, oh, I'm excited for the next episode. But because we already know where this is all going, I don't think it actually serves its intended purpose very well. I think it very obviously should have been the first scene of the episode instead of the last scene. So overall, I think that if you're a fan of The Stand, this might not do it for you. I think that if you're a huge fan, a super fan of the series, you might find some of the choices that they've made this episode frustrating. I question the structural decisions. I think that it weakens the overall story and takes away from the momentum. And overall, I think this is a very well-produced series. It kind of sits in this awkward place in between HBO and, a network television show, because that's kind of where CBS All Access sits. But it does feel like they've put a lot into this series. They've cast it pretty well, and they're doing their utmost to make it a faithful adaptation that people who loved the books will be able to embrace. But I wish they had given a little bit more of a gritty and grimy feel. I think it feels a little bit too polished, a little bit too digital in terms of the photography and in terms of the directorial style. I think it would be stronger if it felt a little bit more lived in as a world. But this is only the first episode, and it'll be interesting to see where they go from here. The reason I don't give this show my unconditional endorsement is because I think that this story starts out very, very strong and then kind of peters out. And I could see this mini-series doing the same thing. I think that the last third of the story was kind of anticlimactic, and to me, honestly, didn't really feel like it fit with what came before. But so far, I like the effort that they're putting in. I think it's a pretty strong opening episode, and I'm definitely going to check out future episodes. But this is an awkward place for this miniseries to be, because I think it would be a lot more successful if it was on Netflix or HBO or on another network where it had more subscribers. And also, just even honestly, I know I'm not always a big fan of binging, but this particular series I feel like might call for a binge in a similar way that this novel just calls to be read through in almost, I mean, it's impossible to do it because it's 1,400 pages, but to be read through as quickly as possible. So I feel that being on CBS All Access might be the kiss of death for this, that people aren't going to appreciate it as much, or they're going to be tempted to just pirate it, because who wants another streaming service, especially one that just doesn't have that much content compared to others. So those are my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As I said, I'm Drew. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing to see my upcoming reviews of future episodes of The Stand and other shows, including American Gods. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.